Hello, class. I want to go over some of the more difficult learning objectives for Unit 5, which covers chapters 19 through 22. I think chapter 19 on Richard Nixon and the Middle East and energy and Watergate, while very important and not super easy to comprehend, is not a chapter that I've had a lot of problems with on exams in terms of people missing a lot of items, at least in comparison with some of the other chapters. So I do want to skip forward and dive right on into chapter 20 that is talking about the conservative resurgence and Ronald Reagan. And one of the things there that the learning objectives ask for number 6, learning objective 26, is identifying the Reagan Democrats and how they helped build a new GOP coalition. This is really one of the first times where the Republicans began to peel off a considerable amount of blue-collar voters that had been solidly Democratic, loyal Democrats, really dating back to the New Deal because of the Democrats' superior support for unions, etc. But there are a lot of other factors, excuse me, that Republicans could use to peel them away, including a promise of increasing military strength in the wake of Vietnam, but probably even more importantly, a lot of other cultural issues, including abortion. This is the decade of Roe v. Wade, a court case coming out of Texas that made it all the way to the Supreme Court that did legalize abortions in the first trimester. And that allowed the Republican Party to get a lot of working class votes from both Catholics and evangelicals who were on the rise in the 1970s. So these were all so-called Reagan Democrats, people who had tended to vote Democrat traditionally that now switched over to the Republican Party in 1980, many of whom have remained there for a variety of reasons. One quote that I like a lot that I think will help you as you understand the phenomenon of Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan is Goldwater lost against the New Deal, but Reagan won against the Great Society. What do I mean by that? When Barry Goldwater ran for president as a Republican in 1964 and lost handily to Lyndon Johnson, he was not only opposed to the Civil Rights Act, as we had discussed in 2 chapters ago, but he really would have preferred to have rolled back the New Deal almost completely, including Social Security. And that did not go over well with working class America. And that's one of the reasons he was trounced so decisively. Ronald Reagan was a huge fan of Barry Goldwater, worked for Barry Goldwater during the 1964 campaign. But Reagan had a little more charisma, a little more telegenic charm coming out of Hollywood as a former actor, and then had worked his way up. He originally had been a liberal back in the 40s, but had switched over to the Republican Party, worked his way up, and became governor of California in the 1960s. He was a big part of the conservative counter-revolution, even long before he was president. But when he ran in 1980, he never said, hey, we're going to get rid of Social Security or the core entitlements of the New Deal or anything, including even Medicare, which had been added in 1965. But what he was running against was what he and his followers viewed as the excesses of the Great Society, which was the money being spent on welfare, public housing, etc. in the inner cities, Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, which had mixed results. And Reagan really went after especially people who were taking advantage of welfare and not out there trying to look for a job. And these were the ones that were causing a lot of frustration among people that did work. That wasn't necessarily a big percentage of people on welfare that described, but those are the ones that Reagan definitely singled out and put the emphasis on. So I think if you understand that quote, Goldwater lost against the New Deal, but Reagan won against the Great Society, that in order to do that, you learn not only a little bit about Goldwater and his loss in 64 and Reagan's victory in 1980, but it also requires you to understand what the New Deal and Great Society were as well. So we can kind of scaffold that on up into this unit. In terms of learning objective 20-7 with Reaganomics, you can really contrast this with the New Deal, where the New Deal was using deficit spending, stimulus spending, where the government was out there actively creating jobs in order to jumpstart the economy, get people working, and then the economy would start buzzing and humming, and then the money would come back to the government in the form of taxes. The way Reagan looked at that is from the supply side of economics, which is to say that the people need a greater supply, or corporations need a greater supply of money in their pocket in the first place, which you can do just by lowering taxes. So lowering taxes will also have the effect of stimulus spending. As it turns out, John Maynard Keynes actually had written about both of these approaches, even though 99% of the time, if you read about Keynes and Keynesian economics, they're talking about more of the stimulus spending, government stimulus spending, to offset when the economy is down, when we are in a recession. Counter-cyclical spending, as it's sometimes called. But you can come at it from the other approach and cut taxes as a form of stimulus as well, and that's what Reagan did. That's one part of Reaganomics. Another big part of Reaganomics is deregulation, which is to say getting rid of laws, or sometimes even whole agencies and things like that, shrinking, making the government leaner. And really this begins under Jimmy Carter in the 1970s, and Congress already began to deregulate certain industries like telecom, which is now an open free market industry. Airlines, where there used to have been sort of a 5-airline oligopoly that ran the United States Airlines. Those things were deregulated earlier in the 1970s. Reagan continued with that approach by trying to get rid of environmental laws, trying to get rid of white-collar laws governing accounting and banking, loosening that up a lot. That had mixed results because it did help the economy, but also created a lot of corruption, especially in the savings and loan industry, that ended up harming the economy. And then also deregulation of communications, and this is a huge one, because the government in the mid-1980s got rid of the 1949 Fairness Doctrine, whereby people had to be, quote, fair and try to tell both sides of the story and present news in more of a factual manner. And that coincided with the advent of cable television and then the development of the internet about a decade later. And the combination of all that has created a real free-for-all in media coverage, which I'm sure all of you are aware of, where people are really just going and reaffirming their views in their own little hermetically sealed chamber and really talking past each other. And so not only are we disagreeing on a lot of things today, but we really don't even agree on what reality is in the first place. We don't have any agreed upon set of facts to work with. Everyone's got their own facts. So it's created a real mess, which has endangered our republic, in my opinion, and that of many other people. However, the good news is there is a lot of great journalism out there, and it is good to read on both sides. There's nothing wrong with op-eds as opposed to factual news. You want to get a combination of both. You want to learn what's going on, but you also want to go deeper with opinionated pieces. But really, it's incumbent on you to read across the spectrum if you're going to get any proper perspective today. And overall, we haven't really been able to come through on that so far. So it's up to politicians to see whether they want to take advantage of that and make it worse, or try to heal the divisions in our society. And this brings us to chapter 21, which at the very top of 21, it talks about this increased partisanship. When we say partisanship, we mean people's affiliation and allegiance to political parties more than their allegiance to, say, the country or their overall view of patriotism. And that's gotten much, much worse in the last 20 or 30 years, and there are a variety of reasons for that. One of them is the issue of the media, and that's purportedly depicted here in this image, which shows Twitter traffic during the 2016 election, with conservatives in red and liberals over here in blue, and the way they don't talk to each other. I'm not sure exactly how they came up with this, but it's an interesting graph either way. It represents what were the reality that we're living in right now. So media deregulation, the fragmentation of media, is one of the contributing factors, but there are others as well. And one of these is gerrymandering. Gerrymandering goes all the way back to the beginning of the United States, because each state has 2 senators, and those senators don't correspond to any particular district. It's just 2 per state. But for the congressmen and congresswomen, those do correspond to districts within a state that they have to rearrange from time to time to match the changing population of the state. Now, the smart way to do that, and the way some states do it, is they turn that over to an independent commission, and then they can do it in a fairer way. But in many states, including Texas, the party that's in power gets to redraw the lines themselves. So of course they can redraw those lines in a very advantageous way. That's always been the case, but it's even more true now today with improved software. So you can see here, for instance, this district here is 60% blue, 40% red. You could divide that up in many different ways. If you divide it up this way, all 5 districts would be blue. However, if you divided it up this way over here, then you end up with majority red, 3 red to 2 blue, switching that 60-40 allotment. So they sometimes say, you know, we don't choose our politicians anymore. The politicians choose us. That's what they're talking about, is gerrymandering. And this has come up before the Supreme Court a couple times, and the attempts at reform have fallen short. The Supreme Court basically said you can do this for partisan reasons, but you can't for racial reasons. Well, of course, there's huge overlap between civil rights issues, racial issues, and political partisan issues. So we're stuck with kind of a crummy system there when it comes to redistricting. There's ways you can take advantage of this if you're the party in power. You can either pack it or crack it, as they say. With a city like Austin, for instance, which comedian Jon Stewart described as a blueberry floating in a bowl of tomato soup, which is to say a very blue area in an otherwise red state. You could just circle that whole area and write it off. That's called packing it, and say, okay, we're going to give the Democrats that area and then take all the other areas around it. Or what they've done more recently with Austin is they've cracked it, which is to say they have tiny little vectors, angles coming in for the districts that carve up Austin. So if you talk to friends and relatives that live around Austin, you'll find that many of them live in different districts, and then those districts fan out into bigger areas, out into the rural areas. The result of all this is that we have fewer and fewer swing districts, where we have fewer purple districts, as they sometimes say, where either party could win that district. And in those cases, then that tends to push the parties toward the middle, and they're more moderate, and they're willing to work with each other. They're willing to explore bipartisanship, etc. But if your district is really very red or very blue, then the biggest challenge for that congressman or congresswoman is somebody who's more radical yet, and even more conservative or more liberal, challenging that person in the primaries. So these people are not voted into office to go compromise with each other or explore bipartisan, legislation or anything like that. They're sent to Congress to go do war and try to take over the place and vanquish the opponent. So we have more and more of these, fewer and fewer swing districts in the United States because of gerrymandering. So both parties are guilty of gerrymandering. In Texas, it would have been traditionally more the Democratic Party on up until the Republicans finally took control of the state in the 1980s and 90s, and now it's Republicans. Okay, so partisanship is going to impact all of these bigger issues in Chapter 21. And that includes things like trade, globalization. Although when it comes to the idea of trade and whether or not we should just have free trade and have as few barriers as possible, have as few tariffs as possible or import duties that give an advantage to American goods by making foreign goods artificially more expensive. This debate, I think, of the 3 debates that we talk about in this chapter with healthcare and the financial meltdown, this one is probably the least partisan, because really there are huge um, there are elements within both political parties favor either a liberal trade policy, which is free trade. That's the most economic overall for the most people. It keeps things cheaper. It keeps our imports cheaper. It's why stuff is so cheap at Walmart, which is good for the economy in terms of keeping inflation down, especially for working class and poor Americans. Or, excuse me, the idea of protectionism, which is that we should have high taxes on foreign goods coming in or tariffs coming in so as to artificially bump those up and make those more expensive, and that will help American manufacturers. So for instance, if you put a high tariff on steel coming out of China, yes, that would help steel manufacturers in Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Baltimore and in the United States, which would be good. The steel workers in the U.S. would be able to keep their jobs. However, there's a reason why people would otherwise buy Chinese steel, which is that it would be cheaper. So if you artificially block that, then you're making steel more expensive in America, which then makes construction more expensive in America for everyone who lives here. For instance, if they were going to renovate the Rio Grande campus here at ACC or build a new campus at Highland Mall or the San Gabriel campus in Leander, ACC has to buy steel with the tax money of Austin citizens or your tuition money. So if we bump up the price of steel to save American steel manufacturers, then we're going to bump up your taxes and tuition in order to buy that steel to do construction. So there are arguments on both sides. It's always complicated. Trade, a perpetual case of constantly hurting some people and helping others all the time. There's no other way around it. Now, back in the 1990s, both parties were really pushing toward more free trade. That seemed to be the consensus among economists. And one of the first areas that the United States began to open up was North America. And so with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the United States and Canada and Mexico began to rid themselves of as many trade barriers as possible. So we could have goods going freely back and forth between those three countries, and whoever could provide something the cheapest or make it the cheapest, and they were the ones who made it. One of the reasons, I guess, why I-35 is as crowded as it is. I think it'd be crowded anyway, even with just Austinites, but you got a lot of traffic coming out of Mexico, going all the way up into the northern United States. With both parties favoring free trade, then what about all the Americans who were suffering from free trade? Let's say you lost your job because that job was moved overseas. Well, you get a really interesting third-party candidate there in Ross Perot that ran in 1992, who, in opposition to NAFTA, excuse me, Ross Perot decided to drop out of the 1992 presidential race a couple weeks before the actual election and still got almost 20% of the vote in that race, with the other two candidates being George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton won that election. Bill Clinton was one of the first Democrats to really come out and be solidly pro-trade, free trade, which is an interesting move for the Democratic Party, because part of them being the New Deal party and the working class blue collar party was their support for tariffs, because those help American unions. One of the things that's weakened American unions a lot in modern times is there's a threat of them being undercut all the time, because any American company can pull up stakes and go open up a factory, over in Asia somewhere and outsource that labor if it's cheaper. So the Democratic Party really was kind of licking their wounds after the dominance of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And people like Bill Clinton said, hey, we need to move closer to the center on economic issues, open ourselves up more to free trade. And also, as unions weakened, then the Democratic Party was getting less campaign donations from unions, which meant that they were going to get those campaign donations elsewhere, from the same place where Republicans had always got them, which is Wall Street and corporate America. So the Democratic Party became a little more corporate under Bill Clinton, and that continued on through Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and a lot of the mainstream Democrats. Okay, well, I don't want to spend too much time on trade here, but one of the agreements that was struck under Barack Obama, really they worked on it for many, many years, but wasn't really finalized until toward the end of his presidency in 2015, 2016, is that they were going to expand this free trading zone here that they had developed with NAFTA and try to gain some trading partners out around the world, especially along the Pacific Rim here in Asia, where we would also have no barriers to trade, no tariffs on either side or anything like that. Free flow of goods is the most efficient type of manufacturing and trade possible. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you can see over here in Asia who it excluded in Asia, I think is very important, which is China. And the idea behind it was ABC, anyone but China, so that we could then increase our leverage in trade negotiations with China, because China was stealing a lot of technology and taking advantage of American corporations over there in ways that were beginning to anger American politicians on both sides of the aisle and the American public. The companies that went over there, and American companies wanted to go over there. Of course, that's the biggest growing market in the world. So of course they wanted to be over there, but they were also signing technology sharing agreements whereby the Chinese were taking a lot of their technology, and they also stole some military technology from some of our more cutting edge fighter jets, etc. So the way Obama was looking at it is, hey, we want to tell them that we have other partners we can trade with. So if things go awry with you, we'll go elsewhere. But the Trans-Pacific Partnership didn't have a lot of transparency or anything like that in terms of how it was put together. Of course, it couldn't, because they had so many different countries. They couldn't all run back to their home country and have people take a vote on it or anything like that. But Donald Trump was able to build on that momentum that Ross Perot had started earlier back in 1992 and look at the victims of globalization, people who had lost their jobs in the United States, and to tap into their anger toward big trade agreements like this. And then eventually Hillary Clinton went along with it too, and she also opposed the TPP. So as it turns out, then once Donald Trump came into office, he pulled the United States out of the TPP. However, that did weaken his leverage then in his negotiations with China. And it also cost American farmers billions of dollars, because they were selling livestock and crops to these countries over here. Of course, the biggest potential buyer when it comes to American farming is over there in China with soybeans and other commodities. So be aware that free trade is going to constantly have all kinds of advantages and disadvantages depending on who you are in the United States. If we cut ourselves off completely from trade, that would hurt our economy horribly. For one thing, it would make goods here much more expensive, but also we are exporters ourselves. If you look at the S&P 500, over half of the money generated by those corporations today is overseas. So something to keep your eye on. Later in that chapter, we talk about healthcare. I don't want to dive quite as deeply into that because we're running a little short on time here, and some of these issues are very complicated, but you're aware of how the United States, dating all the way back to World War II, when Franklin Roosevelt capped wages, but we had full employment, then companies began to offer benefits, like, for instance, healthcare insurance. Unions also like that, because that was a perk that they could win in their negotiations with these companies. And one thing led to another. Next thing you know, we have sort of a patchwork employer-based healthcare insurance system, which works pretty well for lots of people. Probably 60 or 70% of Americans, it works just fine. And there's usually matching, so the employer and the employee both contribute part of the paycheck to the healthcare coverage. But what about the people that don't work for a big company? Small companies, of course, they can't afford this as much, because the bigger the pool, the cheaper the premium. You have people that are caught between jobs. You have people that were sick on one job and had a disease, and then they have the so-called pre-existing condition, well, then the next company doesn't want to hire them because that would raise their healthcare insurance. So it's a pretty big mess for the other 30% of Americans. And in fact, by far the biggest cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States is healthcare costs, which are very, very expensive, especially in the United States. We don't have any caps on provider costs, how much hospitals and doctors can charge for certain procedures, which are then vary and cost a lot within the United States and are generally far more expensive than they are in other countries. So the way other countries have dealt with it is they just basically had every taxpayer contributes to a single payer system, and then everybody has total coverage, which not only is better coverage, but also overall is cheaper than doing it through private insurance because you don't have the profit margin that the insurance companies are going for. So there have been various ideas as to how to kind of patch this system together without doing something so radical as to actually extend universal health care insurance to Americans under 65. Nixon had ideas, Bush had ideas, Bill Clinton had ideas, and his wife at the time, Hillary Clinton, worked on a proposal that ended up getting shot down in Congress. Obama finally got the Affordable Care Act pushed through in his first year of his presidency. You can see here that it did lower unemployment, or the people who are not covered, the uninsured in the United States, but also somewhat unpopular because the way they would, the insurance companies would agree to stop these catastrophic cancellations where they rescind people's insurance right when they get sick, and where they would agree to actually pay out when people needed it. The only way they said they could afford that would be if everyone in America buys private health insurance, including younger and healthier people. Well, if you're young and healthy, first of all, you'd be wiser to have health insurance anyway. But the bottom line is that mandate portion, which makes that system work, was somewhat unpopular, and so there was some pushback on that. And then under Donald Trump, they got rid of the mandate. So it's hard to tell whether the Affordable Care Act is going to continue, but it is still chugging along, and it continues to keep the rates of uninsured people down. So it was criticized as being socialist. It's not socialist. It's kind of big government in a way, because the government is involving itself and forcing people to buy insurance. But the whole point of it is to avoid having socialized healthcare insurance by instead forcing Americans to buy private healthcare insurance. So that's not socialism. What is socialism is Medicare, because we do have universal coverage for Americans over 65. So interesting tweet here from Donald Trump. Of course, the Australian system, like all countries in the developed world, is universal healthcare insurance, single payer coverage. I don't think that's quite what he was getting at there. He claimed to have a plan that was both cheaper and better than Obamacare. He's keeping it a secret. Okay, let's move on to the financial meltdown of 2008, 2009. Now, if you've dived into this section at all, you're probably pulling your hair out and wondering, how am I supposed to understand this? This is way too tedious and way too complex. Yes, it is. And in fact, that's one of the secrets to Wall Street sauce, is they keep things very complicated and too dry for people to understand. And that allows them to find ways to basically make a lot of money. And you also want to keep in mind that a lot of people on Wall Street also did not fully comprehend what was going on. So let's try to do our best here. And I've drawn up a little diagram, a little chart to help us take a look at it. And you don't need to feel like you fully mastered it or anything like that. I'm going to ask a couple fair questions on the exam, and one of them involves what sorts of deregulations did Wall Street convince Congress to push through in the late 1990s that helped bring this about. And then I'm also going to ask you to look a little bit about how the two political parties responded to the financial meltdown. This was one of the biggest financial crises in the United States since the Great Depression, since the 1930s. 1970s were pretty bad also with stagflation, and then you had this, and then with what's going on right now with coronavirus, it's too soon to tell exactly what the economic impact of it is going to be. I start with this photo here, and this may seem totally irrelevant, but one of the points I wanted to make early in this presentation is that the US government is not the only entity that issues bonds. You have municipal bonds at the local level. Basically, these are ways where people are loaning money to the government, and the government returns it to them at interest. That's what US treasuries are. That's what US bonds are. Corporations also issue bonds. So in other words, they get investors to lend them money at a certain interest rate. And oftentimes the big Wall Street banks would underwrite those bonds so that if that company went out of business, the investor would still get their money back from the Wall Street bank. And some of these bankers were sitting around, I think they were on a vacation down in Florida somewhere, and laying on the beach and asking themselves, wow, what would happen if a really huge company like Exxon, if we wrote a bunch of bonds for them, and then let's say they had one of their oil tankers up in Alaska, had a little too much to drink before they left the port of Valdez, and with a single hold ship ran aground and all that oil spilled out of the hold into the bay. And that angered Americans so much that they decided to just boycott Exxon, and nobody bought their gas there, and the whole company went out of business. Now, that didn't happen. The oil spill did happen in the late 1980s, but the widespread boycott of Exxon did not happen. But something like that could happen. In other words, some major corporation could go completely bankrupt, and then Wall Street banks would be sitting there holding these bonds that they would have to pay off. That'd be a problem. And so they began to then discuss inventing a form of insurance for themselves called a credit default swap. So it's similar to you and I buying insurance for our house burning down, or car insurance, or health insurance, or something like that. This is a way to insure banks against this sort of exposure to big companies. So basically, the people who bought these credit default swaps then were other banks that you could think of as, say, insurance companies. So we have corporate bonds over here to companies like, for example, Exxon. We got a lot of big investment banks here on Wall Street, like JP Morgan, Bear Stearns, Goldman Sachs. A couple more retail-oriented banks like Citibank and Bank of America. Lehman Brothers is another one. They want to limit that exposure, and so they're going to buy insurance through companies like AIG was one of the companies that was issuing these credit default swaps, but there were other companies and also other banks as well. Now, the problem wasn't Exxon over here. The problem were mortgages. When you buy a mortgage, when you borrow for a mortgage for your house, that mortgage gets bought and sold by other people other than your local bank that you happen to sign your paperwork up with. And part of the deregulation of the 1980s and 1990s was to make it easier for people to get home loans. And really both parties wanted this. The Republicans liked it because if the person was poorer or had a poor credit rating or their job was a little more tenuous, they could charge them a higher interest rate. And those high interest rates, of course, are something that banks like because they make more money that way. Democrats liked it because it allowed for poorer people to buy homes, and that was a big part of their agenda from the New Deal moving forward. And so the Wall Street would buy up all of these mortgages all together and shuffle them around into what were called mortgage-backed securities, or credit default obligations, which were basically a whole bunch of mortgages packed together, hopefully with some good ones and bad ones mixed in there, so that if people defaulted on their mortgage, that would be more likely among the people with the subprime mortgage rates, which is to say the higher mortgage rates. Then that would sort of be balanced off by a diversified portfolio because there'd be a bunch of good mortgages mixed in there with it. But what happened was that under Alan Greenspan, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve for many years, including under many presidents, including Reagan and the first Bush, and then Clinton, and then George W. Bush, the Federal Reserve began to kind of get away from this thermostat way of looking at the Federal Reserve that I described earlier, whereby if the economy is going poorly, then they're going to put more cash out into the system, so that through the laws of supply and demand, they're going to lower interest rates, and then people will be more likely to buy new cars and buy homes and everything like that, what they want them to do. But if the economy is starting to go really well, then they're going to raise those interest rates so as to curb inflation and cool the jets a little bit. Alan Greenspan was much more of the mindset that we should just always keep them low all the time, even when times are good, and then it'll get even better. Well, what did people do with low interest rates when the economy was going really well? They invested in real estate. So we had a huge real estate bubble forming in the 90s and aughts, where a lot of people were buying homes just to flip the home or as an investment. In fact, to this very day, over half of the homes bought in Austin are by investors rather than somebody who's actually ultimately going to live there. Great investment. As realtors will tell you, God's not making more land, so there's no way it could go down. But there was a way it could go down, which is that there was a bubble forming and real estate was getting too expensive in relation to how much people earned in their salaries. If you look at home prices and salaries from World War II on up through the 1990s, they track each other almost perfectly for obvious reasons. But what happens in the late 90s and the early aughts is that home prices began to skyrocket. And that's going to cause a potential problem here with these big banks, because for every $1 that you and I have in that bank, they have the right, they have the right to gamble 10 times more than that on whatever investment they want to make, especially in the investment banks. And for them, that investment was real estate, buying more and more of these mortgage-backed securities, which they then sold off to foreign banks and pension funds in the United States. Everybody loved them. Real estate, what could be more solid than that? They're making tons and tons of money. And as they did that, they managed to push through a lot of deregulations in Washington, D.C., basically by bribing politicians, which is legal in the United States in the form of campaign donations. Included in those were, for instance, a new law that legalized the buying and selling of these credit default swaps and mortgage-backed securities on a stock market. It was an unregulated, hidden stock market, and just unlimited amounts. And in fact, that market became bigger than the actual stock market. The shadow market was many, many times bigger in credit default swaps and mortgage-backed securities than, for instance, in other words, the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ or the other main commodity markets in Chicago. But another thing that they pushed through was the idea that we are now going to be able to gamble 30 times $30 for every $1 that they get from a customer. And so the ratios, the leverage ratios were loosened up a lot. They also got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act from back in the 1930s, whereby banks had to put up a firewall between retail banking, customer banking, like where you and I put our paychecks, and investment banking, where they take too much risk, where they take more risk, excuse me. Why get rid of that law? Well, because we hadn't had any bank failures or bank panics like we had back in the Great Depression. That law had worked so well that we might as well just get rid of it. Well, no, there was a reason why it had worked, why we hadn't had a lot of bank failures, is because that law was there in the first place. So got rid of that. That didn't impact the really big investment banks, but it did impact some of the retail banks on the periphery of the crisis, like Citibank and Bank of America, Wells Fargo to a lesser degree. So we have all of this funny business going back and forth here, and it's all okay. There's no problem with any of it. Everybody's going to make a lot of money. They're going to make millions and millions of dollars in short-term bonuses, as long as the real estate market continues to go up. But if the real estate market goes down or it collapses, then that's when this idea of taking every one of your dollars and gambling 30 of it, that's going to be a problem. Well, aren't these mortgage-backed securities, aren't they rated highly by the ratings agencies like Moody's and Standards and Poor? Aren't they giving them A ratings, B ratings to say that they're safe? Yes, but that was also corrupt, because the problem with that system is if the bank doesn't get the ratings they want from a ratings agency, then they'll just go to a different ratings agency. And the ratings agencies were getting paid on quantity rather than protecting the legacy and the reputation of their companies for being strict and grading investments accurately. So long and short of all this is when the stock market went down, these banks started to collapse, and they had invested so much with each other that they were dragging each other down. Unfortunately, about 40% of all of the money in the United States is in these banks. So it's very concentrated. And that's what people mean when they say too big to fail. They don't mean that the bank presidents are a bunch of bigwigs who are going to go bribe politicians in Washington and get whatever they want. That's also true, but that's not what they mean by too big to fail. What they mean is that if these banks all failed, then the entire United States economy would indeed also crumble and fail. So there's tremendous systemic risk there that's building in the banking system, the stock market, the public, et cetera, which is just too high. This is, Tim Geithner, who was the chair of the regional Federal Reserve in New York City at the time, said this is foam on the runway time here. This is a major collapse here. If this happens, this is going to be worse than 1929, 1930. Worse by far. In 1929, 1930, only 16% of Americans were invested in the stock market. But now most Americans are, through their 401ks, through their pensions. The big problem back then was that the banks were invested in the stock market. They were, again, also still invested. In fact, the biggest banks were massively invested in these mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps. So the government basically had to do something. Now, one thing that the Federal Reserve did was just pump massive amounts of cash into the banking system. Ben Bernanke, who had replaced Greenspan and was now chair of the Federal Reserve, was also an historian and a student of the Great Depression. He knew that the banking system was the key to keeping the economy up. So they swapped massive amounts of cash for all kinds of other things like treasuries, assets, anything, even mortgage-backed securities, all kinds of things. They were pumping $80 billion a month into the banking system throughout 2008 through 2012 or so. Well, what about the credit default swaps? Didn't they have on insurance on these if the mortgage-backed securities went bad? No, not if they all went bad at the same time. Think of what would happen to State Farm if a gigantic hurricane came and wiped out all of the American Southeast all at the same time rather than just one city here or there. Would they be able to pay? Of course not. They don't even have remotely enough money to pay everyone off at the same time. So they were also going down, as would be the case with the FDIC. Your money is insured in your banks up to $200,000, but that whole system is based on only a few banks going under or being robbed at the same time. If they all went under at the same time, would the FDIC be able to pay all Americans? No way. Not even remotely would they be able to do that. So had this occurred, we would have lost our regular money in our banks. The cash machine wouldn't have worked on Monday morning. This would have been a major disaster. And one of the things the Treasury and Congress decided to do then was the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which a lot of people, a lot of critics saw as a bailout. It was kind of a bailout of these big banks here, but they realized that they just absolutely could not let them crumble. They really were too big to fail. But it wasn't just a pure bailout, as often understood by its critics, because really they loaned money and invested money in the banks. So it's a little bit more like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that we had under Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, the government actually got money back from TARP. They made money on TARP. So keep that in mind. I think TARP probably one of the most unpopular success stories in American history. Since it was a success and the whole economy collapsed, then nobody knew what the problem might have been in the first place. It was kind of like the Cuban Missile Crisis in that way. But I want you to then also read further down into that section and look at how the various political parties have dealt with it. What was the attitude toward this of, for instance, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, um, uh, Congress or senators like John McCain and Elizabeth Warren? What was the attitude of the Tea Party, et cetera? This crisis and the unpopular TARP, in many ways, along with the unpopularity of the mandate from Obamacare, is really what launched the Tea Party, which then morphed into the Trump wing of the Republican Party, which is now the entire Republican Party. So a complicated topic. Don't feel bad if you don't grasp it the first time. Try to be mindful of some of the main deregulations that helped bring it about and how the political parties dealt with it. Okay, well, this little lecture is going to be a little bit longer than some of the others, but that's because the topics are kind of complicated. But we get into the last chapter here, and chapter 22, and we're looking at especially learning objectives 3 and 5. 22.3 asks to evaluate Ronald Reagan's record on Soviet relations based on material at the beginning of the chapter, and then the part where it talks about how the Cold War ends. And this is an interesting topic, I think. Suddenly it seems a little easier to understand compared to credit default swaps, but a little bit a good example, I think, of how liberal and conservative historians interpret history differently. And it's high stakes because how we interpret history, then we're going to use that as a guide, a guiding light, as we move into the future and what our policies are going to be on in the future. The way conservatives look at Reagan is that his peace through strength strategy worked very well, which is that we were going to increase military spending a lot and strengthen the U.S. military and kind of spend the Soviets under the table. They would not be able to keep up with it. And so we're going to be pretty harsh. We're going to be, pretty hardcore, challenge them, etc. Get away from the détente sort of mentality that you had seen under Nixon and Kissinger, a little bit under Carter, not quite as much. But a lot of this arms buildup actually did begin more under Carter than people realize, especially with advances in intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were now much more accurate around the world, and missiles that you could fire out of nuclear-powered submarines. Jimmy Carter commanded a nuclear sub early in the Cold War before he became a politician. But anyway, Ronald Reagan, he scared liberals who thought, okay, he's going to bring about World War III. He's too reckless. He's going to bring about Armageddon. He has this weird biblical views of the book of Revelations and how the world's going to end in 1988 and all that. And yes, it was very scary. He was getting advice from his wife Nancy's astrological charts, and he seemed like kind of a loose cannon, a little bit too much of a cowboy, and that this was just going to heighten the Cold War, and this was going to bring us back to the way things had been, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were constantly on the edge of Armageddon there. But Reagan's policy did work. The Soviet Union was unable to keep up with the arms race, and they did start to capitulate a little bit under Mikhail Gorbachev, partly because Mikhail Gorbachev really wanted to reform the Soviet Union anyway, and he wanted to bring in a little bit more free market play into their economy, a little bit more freedom of the press with glasnost and perestroika, etc. And so the whole thing ends up being a huge success story because the Cold War ended peacefully with arms reduction talks and then an official declaration of the end of the Cold War by Gorbachev, really kind of toward the very end of Ronald Reagan's presidency, but especially toward the very beginning of George H.W. Bush's presidency with the C6 summit. Whereas more liberal historians look at this and they say, well, Reagan is overrated. He didn't ride in on a white horse and boost the military up and win the Cold War single-handedly or anything like that. The basic problems had to do with the weakening economy within the Soviet Union. and other problems they had had with an unsuccessful war ventures in Afghanistan in the 1980s, which had brought a lot of drug use into the Soviet Union. But the basic fact was that their economy was just no longer, well, it never worked very well. And with the advent of information technology and computers especially, they never were able to keep up with the West in that way. And so the Soviet Union collapsed on its own through economic weakness. Well, like any interpretation, and I talked about this all the way back in Chapter 9 when we looked at the Great Depression, and Chapter 8 with the causes of the Great Depression in the stock market, you don't need to choose between competing interpretations or theories. As long as they're not mutually exclusive, you can throw them all in there as a kind of a perfect storm. I think that's the case here. I think there's definitely truth on both sides. Learn the value of the word and. Something can happen and something else can happen at the same time. Look back at what Ronald Reagan was saying with the fact that the Soviets were not going to be able to keep up with the United States in a renewed arms race. That's really connected to the fact that they were weak economically. So there's some overlap there, I think, between the two interpretations anyway. It helps you as you prepare for the Unit 5 exam. Good luck.